A man builds two rocking chairs before there's anyone to sit in the second one. The whole county says grief has cracked something loose in his head. They're wrong. Elias Rowan isn't waiting on a ghost. He's daring a stranger he hasn't met yet to gamble her whole life on an empty chair and a man she's never seen. One of them answers. And the moment her letter lands on that porch, both their lives split clean down the middle. Stay with me to the end of this one, because the ending changed how I think about trust. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The porch went up before the house did, and that was the first thing people held against him. Elias Rowan stood in the wind off the flatland with a hammer hanging loose in his fist and a half-built farmhouse at his back, and he stared at the porch boards he'd just laid like a man admiring something he wasn't supposed to want. The frame of the house behind him was only studs and air. No roof. No glass in the window holes. A man with sense built the walls first, then the floor, then maybe a porch if he lived long enough and the winters didn't take his fingers. Everybody on the loop knew that order. You built shelter. Shelter came first. Elias had built a porch first, a wide one. 8 feet deep, running the whole front length, milled and planed, smooth enough to walk barefoot, which was an absurd thing to want in a country that froze your wash to the line in October. And on that porch sat 2 rocking chairs. He'd made them himself over the winter, in the lean-to by lamplight, with hands that weren't gentle and weren't quick. The wood was bur oak, hard as a banker's heart, and it had fought him the whole way. He'd ruined a chair's worth of spindles learning the curve of the runners. His knuckles still carried the white seams of the cuts. But the 2 chairs were finished now, and they sat side by side, facing the long brown nothing of the prairie, and one of them had never been sat in. He sat in the right-hand one most evenings. The left one stayed empty. "You're a fool, Rowan." He didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Walt Cady, who farmed the quarter section east of him and had a way of arriving exactly when a man wanted to be alone. Walt's wagon creaked to a stop on the wheel rut that passed for a road, and the horse blew and stamped, and Walt sat up there looking down at the porch with both chairs and the roofless house behind it. "Afternoon, Walt," Elias said. "I said you're a fool." "Heard you the first time." Walt climbed down. He was a short man, wide through the middle, with a sunburn that never quite healed and an opinion on everything that grew, breathed, or held still long enough to be opinioned at. He came up the new porch steps without being asked, which was Walt all over, and he put his hand on the back of the empty chair and rocked it once on its runners. "You burying somebody I don't know about?" Walt asked. "No, 'cause that's what this looks like. Looks like a man set out a chair for somebody who ain't coming." "It's a chair," Elias said. "It don't mean anything yet." "Yet," Walt snorted. He looked at the house, the bones of it, the wind walking right through where the parlor would be. "You got no roof, Elias. Winter's gonna come through here like the devil through a screen door, and you'll be sitting on your fine porch in your fine chair, freezing to death, with the other one empty beside you. That's the picture. That's what you've made." Elias set the hammer down on the porch rail. He was 32 years old that spring, tall and built like a fence post that had decided to take up walking. With a beard he kept short because a long one collected ice, and a face that didn't give much away even when he wanted it to. He'd come out from Ohio 4 years back with a brother and a plan, and now he had the land and not the brother, and people in the county knew enough of that story to leave the edges of it alone. Most people. "The roof will get done," Elias said, "before snow." "And the chair?" "The chair will get done too." Walt looked at him a long moment, and something in his face softened the way a hard man's face does when he's about to say a kind thing and resents himself for it. "Marthy says you should come for supper. Sunday. She worries on you out here." "Tell her I'm fine." "You ain't fine, Elias. A fine man don't build a second chair." Walt went back down the steps, heavier than he'd come up. At the wagon he stopped and looked back. "What are you going to do anyway? Just wait? Wait for some woman to wander out of the grass and decide your ugly face is the one she's been dreaming on?" Elias didn't answer that because he didn't have an answer yet. He had a half-formed thing in his chest that he hadn't said out loud to anyone, partly because it sounded insane and partly because saying it would make it real and then he'd have to do it. Walt drove off. The dust hung in the air behind the wagon, and then the wind took it. Elias stood on his porch a while longer. The sun was going down red and flat over the grassland, the way it did out here, like the whole world was the floor of an empty pan and the fire was somewhere underneath it. He thought about his brother Daniel, who died of the fever the second winter in the soddy they'd built together, coughing in the dark while Elias held a wet rag to his head and told him lies about spring. He thought about how quiet it had been after. Not sad quiet, worse. The kind of quiet that gets into a man's bones and starts to feel normal, and that scared him more than the fever ever had, because he'd watched it happen to other men out here. He'd watched the prairie hollow them out. Old Henslow, 2 claims over, had stopped speaking entirely, just nodded and pointed, gone strange and inward as a turtle. The country did that. It took your people, and then it took your words, and then it took you, and nobody back east ever heard a thing about it. Elias had decided, somewhere in that long quiet, that he wasn't going to let it have him. He didn't quite know how a man fought a thing like loneliness. You couldn't shoot it, couldn't plow it under. But he figured it was like everything else out here. You built against it. You put up something solid before the weather came, and you trusted that the building would hold. So he'd built the porch. And the chairs. The empty one wasn't grief. Walt had it backwards. The empty one was the opposite of grief. It was a bet that the future was coming and that he had a right to lay a place for it. That night, by the lamp, with the wind shouldering against the canvas he'd tacked over the window holes, Elias took out paper and pencil and tried for the first time to write the thing down. He was no hand at writing. His letters came out cramped and backward-leaning, and he spelled the way he talked, which was to say poorly. And after the 3rd ruined sheet, he sat with his head in his hands and nearly quit. Then he thought about the empty chair out there in the dark, getting rained on someday with nobody in it, and he picked the pencil back up. What he was trying to write was an advertisement. He'd seen them in the back pages of the papers that drifted out west, the matrimonial notices, men advertising for wives the way they advertised for a good milk cow. Bachelor, 40, owns 160 acres, seeks healthy woman not afraid of work. They were ugly things, mostly. Lists. A man laying out his property and asking what he could get for it. Elias had read 100 of them and hated everyone, because not one had ever said the true thing, which was that a man could die out here of nothing but silence, and what he wanted wasn't a worker or a body or a cook, but somebody to put words into the air across the supper table so the air didn't stay empty. He didn't have the schooling to say that nice, but he had it in him to say it plain. He worked at it past midnight. He crossed out seeks healthy woman. He crossed out owns acreage. He kept crossing out until what was left was small and strange and didn't sound like any ad in any paper he'd ever read. And he sat looking at it, and he thought, they'll laugh. Then he folded it up and put it in his coat pocket to take to town. The town was called Greer, and it amounted to a single dusty street, a general store, a smithy, a church that doubled as a school, a saloon that called itself a hotel, and the office of the Greer County Beacon, which was run by a man named Pohl, who'd come out from Chicago with a printing press and a grudge against everyone who'd ever told him he'd amount to nothing. Pohl was setting type when Elias came in, his fingers black with ink, his spectacles shoved up on his forehead. The press took up half the room and smelled of oil and lead and the particular sourness of damp newsprint. Pohl looked up, took the measure of Elias the way he took the measure of everyone, as a potential subscriber, source, or fool, and went back to his type case. Rowan, he said, don't tell me. You want to report that your porch has chairs. Heard about that already, have you? Mr. Rowan, I run a newspaper in a town with one street. By Tuesday, I'll know what you had for breakfast. Pohl dropped a slug of type into his composing stick. 2 chairs, 1 empty. Katie's wife told the bishop woman, who told my wife, who told me, you've either gone soft in the head or you're keeping company with a spirit. Folks are betting on which. It's neither, Elias said. Then what is it? Elias took the folded paper out of his coat. He'd recopied it twice on the wagon ride in, trying to make the letters behave, and it was still ugly, but it was the best he had. He set it on the type case between them. I want to run this, he said. Not here. In the big paper, the one that goes back east, the Heartland Companion, the one out of Lincoln that the railmen read. You can wire it to them, can't you? Run it in their personal column? Pohl wiped his fingers on his apron and picked up the paper. He read it once. Then he read it again, slower, and his face did something Elias hadn't expected. It stopped being amused. "You wrote this?" Pole asked. "Yes." "By yourself?" "Who else?" Pole set the paper down. He looked at Elias for a long moment over the top of his shoved-up spectacles, and the press ticked and cooled behind him. "It's bad writing," Pole said. "I know it. The spelling's a crime. You've got honest with 2 N's. There's no... You don't say what you own. You don't say your age. You don't say a single thing a woman would want to know before she crossed 1,000 miles for you." Pole tapped the paper. "And it's the only matrimonial ad I've read in 11 years that didn't make me want to wash my hands after." He sat back. "What do you want it to say at the bottom? Where do they write you?" "General delivery, Greer. I'll come for the mail." Pole pulled the spectacles down onto his nose. "You understand what you're going to get. You'll get cranks. You'll get women looking for a free ride west who'll bleed you and bolt. You'll get men playing a joke. You'll get a preacher's letter telling you you're a sinner for going around the Lord's order of things." He shook his head. "And out of 100 of those, you might get 1 real one. Might. You ready to read 99 ugly letters for the chance at one?" "I built 2 chairs," Elias said. "I figure I can read some letters." Something moved at the corner of Pole's mouth. Not a smile. Pole didn't have those, but the place where a smile would have gone on a softer man. He picked up a clean stick and reached for his type case. "I'll fix the spelling," he said, "but I'm leaving the rest. God help me, I'm leaving the rest. It's the worst written ad I've ever set, and it's going to get more answers than any of them." He glanced up. "You want to know why?" "Why?" "Because it's the only one that sounds like it was written by a man who'd actually be there when she arrived." Pole picked out a letter, then another. "Most of them are written by men trying to get something. Yours reads like a man trying to give something away and not sure anybody'll take it." He clicked the type into place. "Come back Thursday with $2. It'll be in the companion by the end of the month." Elias paid the $2 on Thursday. He didn't have a lot of spare dollars, and 2 of them was a sacrifice he felt, but he laid them on the type case and Pole took them without a word, and that was that. Then came the waiting, which was harder than the building had been. Word got around the way Pole had promised. By the time the ad ran, half the county knew Elias Rowan had advertised for a wife in the back of a Lincoln paper, and the half that knew made sure the other half found out. The story grew the way stories do. By the second telling, he'd offered $100 to any woman who'd marry him. By the 4th, he was dying and looking for someone to inherit. By the time it got back around to Elias himself, at the general store, he'd apparently built a mansion out on the Lou with a ballroom in it, which made him laugh out loud. Alone in the store, while the bishop woman behind the counter looked at him like the rumors might be true after all. The letters started coming the 3rd week. Pole had been right about all of it. The first one Elias opened, standing at the general delivery window with his heart going harder than he'd admit, was from a woman in Missouri who wanted to know the cash value of his livestock and whether he was prepared to support her aging mother, her sister, and her sister's 3 children. The second was from a man in Omaha who'd written 4 pages of filth and a 5th page laughing at him for it. The third was from somebody calling themselves a Christian friend who informed Elias at length that he was destined for hell, which Elias read leaning against the post office wall, eating an apple, mildly entertained. He read them all. He'd told Pole he would, and he was a man who did the thing he said. Some nights he'd come back from town with 5 or 6 letters and sit on the porch. The roof was up by then. He'd kept that promise too, finished it the week before the first frost. And he'd read them in the empty chair's company, and most of them he'd ball up and use to start the morning fire. He almost quit twice. Once after a woman wrote 3 letters in a row that were so kind and so hopeful that Elias had nearly written back, until the 3rd letter named a wedding date she'd already set and a dressmaker she'd already paid and asked him to wire $40 for the gown, and Elias understood he'd been worked by an expert and felt like a fool for a week. The second time was just a low night, a hard cold one in November, when the wind found a seam in the new house and moaned through it all night long, and Elias lay in the dark and thought, Walt was right. You built a chair for a ghost. There's no one out there. There's just letters from people who want your $2 worth of land. But he didn't quit, mostly out of stubbornness, which was the truest thing about him, and not always a virtue. He told the whole county he was going to do a thing, and a part of him would rather freeze on his own porch than let Walt Cady be right. So he kept going to town, and in the first week of December, in a thin stack of 3 letters, there was one with handwriting on the outside that stopped him before he even opened it. It wasn't fancy handwriting. That was the thing of it. The cranks and the schemers and the dressmaker woman, they all wrote pretty, looping, careful, the hand of people performing themselves on paper. This was small and square and fast, set type clean, the letters all the same height like they'd been measured, and the address was exactly right. No flourish, no Esquire, nothing extra. Just his name and the town, written by somebody who didn't waste motion. He didn't open it at the window. He carried it out to the wagon and held it a minute. Then he put it in his breast pocket and drove the whole way home with it there, unread, because some part of him knew that whatever was in it was either the end of the foolishness or the start of something, and he wanted to be on his own porch when he found out which. He read it in the empty chair. That was the only time he ever sat in that one. Her name was Margaret Hale, and 300 miles east, in a railroad town called Asher Falls, she had spent 4 days deciding whether to mail the letter at all. Margaret was 28, which her mother mentioned approximately once a day, in the tone of a woman announcing a debt coming due. She was a typesetter at the Asher Falls Register, one of 2 women the paper employed, and the only one who set type, which she did faster and cleaner than any of the men, a fact the men resented and the editor relied on. Her fingers were stained the same lead gray as Pole's, 300 miles away, though neither of them would ever know they shared that. She had a sharp face that people called handsome when they were being kind and severe when they weren't. Dark hair she pinned up without much patience for it, and a way of looking at a person while they talked that made fools nervous, and made the editor nervous, and made her mother furious. She was, by the standards of Asher Falls, a problem. She'd had 2 offers of marriage in her life. The first, at 21, from a clerk named Pruitt, who told her, as if it were a compliment, that her cleverness would settle down once she had children to occupy it. She told him her cleverness was not a horse to be broke, and that had been the end of Pruitt. The second, at 25, from a widower with a hardware concern who'd been decent enough and dull enough that Margaret had nearly said yes out of pure exhaustion, and had lain awake the night before she meant to accept him, picturing 30 years of suppers across the table from a man who'd never once asked her what she thought about anything, and had got up in the morning and declined. Her mother hadn't spoken to her for a month after that one. "You think you're too good," her mother said more than once. "You think there's some better man coming on the next train. There isn't, Margaret. There's just the men there are. And you keep sending them off, and one day you'll be 40 and setting other women's wedding announcements in lead, and you'll understand what you threw away." The cruelty of it was that Margaret feared this might be exactly true. She didn't think she was too good. She thought, and she'd never have said this to her mother, who'd have wept or worse, understood, she thought she was waiting for a thing she couldn't name and probably couldn't get. Not a handsome man. Not a rich one. She didn't even particularly want children, which was a thing you could not say aloud in Asher Falls and remain a person other people would speak to. What she wanted was harder to put a word to. She wanted a life she'd built on purpose. She wanted to be necessary, not as a wife was necessary, decoratively, the way a clock was necessary, but the way a wheel was necessary to a wagon, where if you took her out, the whole thing fell in the road. She set the news of the world in lead every day, the births and the deaths and the railroad schedules and the prices of wheat, and she felt herself disappearing into the smallness of it, becoming furniture, becoming her mother's prophecy. Then one afternoon in November, breaking down a column of matrimonial ads sent over the wire from the Lincoln Heartland Companion, her fingers stopped on one of them. She read it standing at the composing table with the lead still warm in her hand. She would later try to explain to Elias what it had been, and she'd never quite manage it, because the thing about the ad was what it didn't say. There was no acreage in it, no livestock, no age, no boast, no list of what a woman could expect to gain by crossing half the country to a stranger. It was 4 sentences long, and the spelling had clearly been corrected by someone other than the author, the way you could see the seams where a clean hand had patched a rough one. And what it said, underneath the patched spelling, was that a man had built a porch with 2 chairs on it before he had any cause to, and that one of those chairs was empty, and that he was inviting one honest person. It didn't even say woman, she noticed. It said one honest soul, which she'd thought about for a long time afterward, to someday come and sit in it. Not to marry him, not at first, just to write, to be honest. to see if two strangers could build something true out of nothing but words sent across the distance. It was, she thought, either the most foolish thing she'd ever read or the only honest one, and she stood at the table for so long that the foreman barked at her to get back to work. She didn't write to him that night, or the next. She was not a foolish woman, and she knew exactly how this looked. A lonely spinster falling for a stranger's clever line, the oldest swindle in the personals. She told herself the man was probably toothless, probably drunk, probably 40 years dead by the time any letter reached him, probably a fiction Pole or whoever had invented to sell papers. She told herself her mother would be vindicated, which was nearly enough to stop her on its own. But she kept the clipping. She cut it out of the wire column before she broke the type down, which was technically theft, a strip of someone else's newspaper, and Margaret did not steal. And she carried it home in her sleeve and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, and at night she'd take it out and read the 4 sentences again. One honest soul to someday sit in the second chair. What undid her in the end wasn't the romance of it. She had no romance in her. Her mother could have told anyone that. What undid her was the risk in it. The sheer mad nerve of a man who'd build a chair for a person who didn't exist yet. Margaret had spent her whole life declining things. Declining Pruitt, declining the hardware widower, declining her mother's whole vision of who she ought to be. And she'd done it out of a refusal she was proud of, but lying in the dark she understood that refusing was not the same as choosing. She'd said no and no and no, and she'd told herself that was courage. But a man out west had built a chair which was a yes said into an empty room, said before there was anyone to say it to. And she didn't have a single thing in her own life she'd ever said yes to like that. That, more than the man, more than the words, was what got her to the desk. She wrote the letter 4 times. The first draft was clever and arch and protected her on every side, full of wit she could hide behind. And she read it over and tore it up because it sounded like a woman afraid of looking like a fool, which she was. But the whole point was not to write like one. The second was too earnest, too much of her real self spilled out onto the page. And she tore that one up too because you didn't hand your whole self to a stranger in the first sentence. The third was nothing. Small talk, weather, a comment on the spelling errors in his ad. And she tore it up out of contempt for herself. The fourth one she kept. She wrote it fast, the way she set type, no wasted motion, and she told the truth in it, which scared her more than anything had in years. She told him she'd seen his ad in the wire column she set herself, 300 miles away, and that she'd cut it out and stolen it, which she'd never done before. She told him she didn't know how to do this, and she suspected he didn't either. She told him she had no intention of crossing the country for a man she'd never met, and that he shouldn't take her writing as any kind of promise, and that she'd very likely never write again after this one letter. And then at the bottom, because something in his 4 bad sentences had earned an honest answer, she wrote, "But I noticed you wrote one honest soul and not a wife. And I have been waiting a long time for a question that didn't already know the answer it wanted from me. So here's mine, since you went first. What does a person do, out there, when the silence gets into them? Because I am setting type in a loud and crowded town, and the silence has got into me anyway, and no one here has ever once asked me about it. M. Hale." She nearly didn't sign her own name. She nearly used initials, the way she signed everything, the way she'd learned to make herself smaller so the men at the paper wouldn't bristle. Then she thought about the chair, the empty one, said into the empty room, and she wrote out Margaret underneath the M. Hale, deliberately, the only flourish she'd allow herself. She walked it to the post office before she could think better of it. It was cold, and the streets of Asher Falls were full of people who knew her and would have plenty to say if they knew what she was mailing, and she held the letter against her coat and put it through the slot fast, like dropping something hot, and walked home with her heart going in a way she resented and could not stop. That night her mother asked her why she looked strange, and Margaret said it was the cold, and her mother, who had buried one husband and raised one impossible daughter and missed almost nothing, looked at her over the lamp for a long moment. "You did a thing today," her mother said. It wasn't a question. "I mailed a letter." "To who?" "No one you know." Her mother set down her sewing. The lamp threw her face into the deep lines the years had cut, and for a moment she didn't look angry, only tired, only old, and Margaret felt the guilt of it the way she always did. "Margaret, whatever it is, whatever fool thing you're reaching for now, Her mother stopped, started again, softer. I only ever wanted you safe. That's the whole of it. A safe roof and a settled life, and you not alone when I'm gone. That's not a small thing to want for your child. I know it isn't, Margaret said. Then why do you keep... Because a safe roof with the wrong man under it is its own kind of alone, Mother. And I think you know that better than anyone. It came out harder than she meant it, and she watched it land, watched her mother flinch, and was ashamed because her mother had not had a happy marriage and Margaret had just said so out loud, in their kitchen, in the lamplight, which was a cruel and accurate thing to do. Her mother picked her sewing back up. Go to bed, she said, and that was all, and Margaret went, and lay awake a long time thinking about the chair 300 miles away that she'd very likely just talked herself into never sitting in. It took the letter 11 days to reach Greer. Elias read it in the empty chair, as has been said, the only time he ever sat there. He read it through once, fast, his eyes going too quick over the words to catch them, and then he made himself stop and breathe and read it again slow. When he got to the part about the silence getting into her, I am setting type in a loud and crowded town, and the silence has got into me anyway. He stopped reading altogether and sat looking out at the prairie, which was going gold and then gray as the sun went, and he found that his throat had closed up on him, which had not happened since the second winter, since the Saudi, since Daniel, and he was not a man who let that happen, and he let it happen now because there was no one to see. She'd understood it. 300 miles off, in a town with 100 times the people he had, she'd understood the exact thing he'd built the chair against, and she'd named it back to him in her own words, in that fast square handwriting, and she'd asked him what a person does about it, asked him like he might actually know, like his answer might actually matter to her, which was a thing no one had asked Elias Rowan in a very long time. Walt asked him to supper. The bishop woman asked him his business. No one asked him what he thought, about the silence or anything else. And here was a stranger 300 miles away who'd led with it. He went inside and lit the lamp and got out his bad paper and his pencil, and he sat down to answer her, and he was just as poor a writer as he'd ever been, and it didn't matter even a little. He wrote, Miss Hale, I am not much of a hand at writing, as you can plainly see, and I won't pretend otherwise. He looked at it. It was true, and it was plain, and he left it. You asked what a person does when the silence gets in. I don't rightly know that I have it beat, but I will tell you what I have learned, which is that you can't wait it out. The waiting is how it gets you. You have to put something in the empty room before there is anybody to fill it. That is the whole of why I built the chair. Folks here think I built it for a person. I didn't. I built it for the idea of a person, so the room wouldn't be empty while I waited to find out if you were real. He stopped. He hadn't meant to write you. He'd meant to write she or someone. He looked at the you sitting there on the page, naked and forward and too soon, and he thought about crossing it out, and then he thought about the chair, and he left it. He wrote until the lamp burned low. He told her about Daniel, which he'd told no one in 4 years, told her plain and without dressing it up. The fever, the Saudi, the lies about spring, the quiet after. He told her the prairie took people's words before it took their lives, and that he'd watched it happen and decided it wasn't going to happen to him. He told her he had a temper and not much schooling and a knee that ached when the weather turned, that he was no bargain and she shouldn't take him for one, and that he wasn't asking her to cross any distance, only to write back. Only that. And that he'd keep the chair empty as long as it took to find out if she was the honest soul the ad had asked for, or just the only one who'd written back that he couldn't bring himself to burn. At the bottom he signed it Elias Rowan, and then, because she'd risked her whole name, he added underneath, and the chair is still empty and I find I'm glad of it tonight. He walked it to town the next morning, 3 hours each way, and mailed it, and stood outside the post office in the cold after, feeling lighter and more terrified than he had in years, the way a man feels when he's finally stopped being safe. Across the county, by then, the story of the empty chair had already passed into the kind of legend that small places make of their odd men. They told it at the general store and over supper and at the smithy while the iron heated. Rowan and his 2 chairs, Rowan waiting on a woman out of a newspaper, Rowan gone soft as a peach in the head. Walt Cady told it most of all, with the weary fondness of a man who'd warned his neighbor and been ignored, and every telling of it ended the same way, with the same shake of the head, the same certainty. No one's coming. He built that chair for nobody. Mark it. That second chair will sit empty till the wood rots, and they'll find Elias Rowan dead in the first one some hard winter, and the chair beside him still won't have a soul in it. And they were so sure of it, the whole of Greer County, so sure that the chair was a fool's monument to a thing that would never arrive. That not one of them, not Walt, not Pole, not the bishop woman, not Elias's own doubting heart in its worst hours, not one of them imagined that 300 miles east a sharp-faced typesetter was already sitting up past midnight with a stolen newspaper clipping and a letter she'd told herself she'd never send, reading his bad handwriting by lamplight, and finding that for the first time in her settled, declining, carefully defended life, she could not for anything bring herself to put the pencil down. She wrote back. Of course she wrote back. She'd told him she wouldn't, and she did. And that was the first true thing she ever gave him. The broken promise that proved she'd meant the rest of it. And the chair, 300 miles west, stayed empty and waited. And the wind came down off the flat land and rocked it gently on its bur oak runners all that long cold winter through. The letters went back and forth through January and February, slow as the mail wagons that carried them, which got stuck in drifts twice that winter and had to be dug out by whatever men happened to be nearby and willing. Elias didn't mind the delays. He'd expected to be bad at this. The writing, the waiting, the whole enterprise of putting himself on paper where a stranger could read him. And he was at first exactly as bad as expected. His second letter to Margaret had been stiff and corrected to death. Every sentence that sounded like himself crossed out in favor of something that sounded like a man trying to impress a schoolteacher, and he'd sent it and regretted it the whole way home from the post office. He told her about the land, about the wheat he planned to try that spring, about the dimensions of the house, as if she'd asked for an inventory of his assets. She hadn't. She'd asked about the silence. She'd called him on it too, which he hadn't quite expected. You got careful, she wrote back. Your first letter sounded like a man. Your second one sounded like someone trying to write a letter. I can tell the difference. I set type for a living. I know what careful looks like in prose, and I know what it's hiding. He'd laughed out loud at that, alone at his kitchen table, which startled him. He hadn't laughed out loud at anything since Daniel was alive. He wrote back, You're right, I got scared. I'll try to stop. And he did, mostly. He wasn't a natural correspondent, and he didn't become one, but he found if he wrote late at night when he was tired enough to stop performing, something honest came through the pencil that didn't come through when he sat up straight and tried. He told her about the neighbor east of him, a German homesteader named Bruder, who'd lost all 3 children to diphtheria in the same 2 weeks, and then gone right on plowing his field the next spring. Not because he was hard, Elias said, but because if he stopped, he'd never start again. He told her about the smell of the prairie after a lightning storm, which was the most alive smell in the world to him, and he didn't know what that said about him. He told her he'd tried to read Middlemarch over the winter because a woman at the general store had said it was improving, and he'd made it 40 pages before he put it down, which he figured placed him somewhere between an idiot and a man with poor taste. Margaret wrote back about Middlemarch. She'd read it twice, but she understood why it ran long for a man who was alone. Because reading it required a certain tolerance for complicated people doing slow damage to themselves, which was easier to follow when you were surrounded by the same. She told him about the composing room at the register, about the foreman, Culpepper, who resented her the way a man resents a better horse, constantly, specifically, and with great effort at disguising it. She told him about the way the lead type felt in her hand, the muscle memory of it, the satisfaction of a column set clean and true, the letters all locked tight, no slop, no play. She said it was the one part of her life where she knew exactly whether she'd done a thing right or not, and that she'd built more of herself around it than she'd realized until she was trying to explain it to a stranger in Nebraska. Most people, she wrote, when they ask what I do, hear typesetter, and then hear nothing else. You asked what it felt like. No one has asked me that. I thought you should know it noticed. Elias read that in the empty chair again, though he'd stopped sitting in it after the first time. He always read her letters there, and then got up and it stayed empty, like that was the deal. He read that line 3 or 4 times and understood that she was telling him something careful and important, and he thought about how to answer it for 2 days before he understood that the answer was just to keep asking. So he did. He asked her everything. He asked what her mother was like, and she told him, small and tired, and more afraid than she shows, which comes out as criticism. He asked what the town of Asher Falls was like in February, and she told him it was gray and icebound and smelled of coal smoke and horse manure and the specific loneliness of a town that considered itself almost a city and therefore could not admit it was provincial, which was worse than being actually provincial because at least the genuinely small places knew what they were. He asked what she'd wanted to be when she was 10 years old, before she knew what women were permitted to want, and she took so long to answer that he'd thought the question had offended her. Then the answer came. When I was 10, I wanted to run a newspaper. My own. Not typeset someone else's truths, find them myself and put them in the right words and let people read them and decide. I wanted to be in the room where things were argued over and settled. I told this to my school teacher at 13, and she said that was a fine dream for a boy. I told my father, and he said the same, but kinder. I didn't stop wanting it, I just stopped saying so. I wonder sometimes if I married the type case instead, got as close as the door they'd let me through and called it enough. I am telling you this because you asked, and because I have told no one, and because it seems true that some things need saying to a stranger before they can be said to anyone else. He wrote back, "Then you should run one. The West is full of towns that need a paper and can't keep a printer. I'm not saying come here. I'm saying don't let Asher Falls be the ceiling." She wrote, "I notice you said not saying come here," rather quickly. He wrote back, "I notice you noticed." That exchange sat on the table and Elias looked at it for a long while after he'd written it. This thing they were circling. The thing they never said directly because saying it directly would make it real and fragile and subject to all the weight of practical considerations. And for now, it was still light enough to breathe under. But it was there. They both knew it was there. By March, Margaret had started writing twice a week instead of once, which she would have denied was significant if anyone had been watching to note it. No one was. She wrote the letters at her desk late at night, in the hour after her mother had gone to bed, in the private dark of the house, and she wrote them in a voice she used nowhere else. Not reckless, exactly, but unwound, the way she never allowed herself in daylight. She told him about a composing error she'd made that had printed the mayor's name as Mayor Toad in a piece about civic improvements, and she'd caught it before press, barely, and spent a week in a state of secret hilarity about it. She told him that Culpepper had told her she should smile more, and she'd told him she'd consider it the same time he considered buttoning his collar, and he'd turned so red she'd worried she'd have to get someone to loosen his boots. Elias wrote back about Culpepper, "I know that type. They want the work, but they don't want the worker to know she's doing it." Margaret read that at her desk and held very still for a moment and then wrote, "Exactly that. That is exactly that." It was that kind of correspondence, the kind where two people discover that their private language, the one they'd spoken only inside their own heads, is apparently shared by a stranger in another state who built it independently and arrived at the same words. That's a rarer thing than it sounds. Most people spend their whole lives certain that the way they narrate the world to themselves is slightly off from everyone else's, and most of them are right. Margaret had been sure of it. She'd built her defenses around it, and here was a man who couldn't spell honest on the first try, writing her from a dirt county in Nebraska at midnight, and everything he said landed exactly where she lived. She did not let herself call it what it was. She was too careful for that. But she started wearing her hair differently, just slightly. Not that anyone would have known why. April came, and with it a complication that neither of them had planned for. Margaret mentioned it in a letter that arrived on a rainy Thursday, shorter than her usual ones, the handwriting slightly uneven in a way Elias had learned to read as trouble. "My father has been ill since February. I did not say so before because I could not figure how to say it without the whole letter becoming about it. And I am still not sure I have that figured. He had a weakness of the heart, his second in 3 years, and he is not well. He is not dying. He is diminished. The printing business is his, built from nothing, 22 years of it, and without him on his feet it runs on me and 2 boys who know the press but not the ledgers, and my mother who knows the ledgers but cannot lift the type. I am not writing this as an explanation for anything. I am writing it because you wrote to me about your brother without dressing it up, and I am trying to do the same." Elias read that 3 times, and the 3rd time he found himself staring out the window at the spring mud of his yard, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, thinking about a set of circumstances that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with how this was going to go. He'd known, in the back of himself, that this wouldn't be simple. He'd known it the way you know a front is coming before the clouds show. Something in the air, the way things feel too still. He'd never let himself fully picture what simple would have looked like anyway, because that way was dangerous, and he was a cautious man about hope, which was not a contradiction, it was experience. He wrote back the same night, "Margaret, I am not going anywhere. I have been clear about that from the first letter, and I mean it the same way now. Your father needs you and the business needs you, and that is not a thing I'd ask you to walk away from. Not for me, not for a chair. You didn't make me any promises, and I'm not counting any. But I want to say this once, so we don't have to dance around it. Whatever time this takes, I'll be here. The chair's still here, neither of us is going anywhere, and I think we both know now that we need to know more of each other before this goes another step anyway. So, take the time you need, write when you can. Tell me what it's like, the ledgers and the type, and your mother in the same house, and all of it. I want to know." He almost didn't send it. It felt like too much said, too plain, like a man laying his cards down before the betting was done. He'd thought about whether he was being a fool again, the same Walt Katie was right way, and decided he didn't care. What Margaret had written was the letter of a woman who expected to be abandoned and was getting the abandonment in first, protecting herself by naming the obstacle before it could be used as an excuse. He recognized it because he'd done it himself, in the early letters, getting careful and stiff and presenting only the inventory. She'd called him on it then. He was calling her on it now. She got the letter on a Monday, between the press run and the evening accounts. She read it standing at her father's desk, in the back of the print shop, with the smell of ink and oil all around her, and her father's handwriting on the ledger pages under her hands. She read it twice. Then she folded it very small and put it in her apron pocket and got back to the accounts and did not cry. Specifically and with effort, until she was home and upstairs and the door was shut. Not sad crying. The other kind. She wrote back 2 days later, "You're an unusual man, Elias Rowan." He wrote, "So I've been told, generally not as a compliment." She wrote, "It wasn't not a compliment," and they went on. The spring of that year was punishing. Elias had expected it to be. Spring on the Lou was always a negotiation between the land and everyone trying to use it, and the land usually won the first few rounds. The fields were waterlogged through April, and then in May the water stopped entirely and the ground cracked, and he lost a third of his early planting to the crack and dry cycle that Walt Katie had warned him about and which he'd managed badly the year before and only slightly better this year. He was trying a new wheat variety, a harder husk strain he'd gotten through a seed catalog out of Kansas, and it was doing stranger things than the old variety, growing slower but gripping the ground tighter, and he didn't know yet if that was good news or a different kind of bad news. Walt came by in late May to look at it, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets and his hat pushed back, making the face Walt made when he was about to be reluctantly approving of something. "Stubborn looking," Walt said about the wheat. "That's the idea. Could be it just dies slow instead of fast." "Could be," Elias agreed. Walt was quiet a moment. A meadowlark went off somewhere behind them, and the wind moved through the young stalks, and Elias watched it move the way he'd learned to watch the field, not at any one plant, but at the whole of it, reading the thing like a page. "You still writing to her?" Walt asked. "Yes." "She writing back?" "Yes." Walt nodded at the field. "Heard her father's sick. Katie's wife's cousin is in Asher Falls. Well, was. She moved to Omaha. But last she heard, the family that runs the Register print shop had their oldest on the floor with his heart." "That her family?" Elias looked at him. "How long have you known her name?" Walt gave him a narrow, entirely unapologetic look. "Since February. Pole mentioned it. Pole mentions everything to everybody, Elias. You know that by now." He shrugged his wide shoulders. "Well?" "Yes," Elias said. "That's her family. So she's not coming." "She's not coming yet." "There's a difference?" "Yes," Elias said, and the word was flat and finished, the way he said things when he didn't want to keep talking about them, and Walt, who'd been his neighbor long enough to know that tone, let it go. They stood a while longer looking at the field. "She sounds smart?" Walt asked, eventually, the way a man asks something he's been holding for a while. "Smarter than me." Lord Elias, my dog's smarter than you. That's not a quality. Smarter than most anyone I've met, Elias said, and he meant it. And something in his voice when he said it must have told Walt that the conversation was over, because Walt picked up his hat and resettled it and went back to his wagon without another word on the subject, which was the closest Walt Cady ever got to grace. Ooh. The summer letters were the ones that changed things. Not changed them suddenly. There was nothing sudden about any of this. It moved at the speed of male impatience, which was its own kind of speed. But the summer letters were where the space between them collapsed to something you could almost see across. In June, Margaret wrote, "I have started keeping the accounts in a double-entry method that my father only half understood, and that I have apparently been correcting silently for 2 years without saying so, because correcting a man's own books to his face felt unkind, and now I understand I was not doing him any kindness. He knows now. We had a difficult conversation about it that I will spare you the full account of, but by the end of it, he had said something he'd never said to me before, which is that I was the better printer of the two of us, and that he'd known it for years. I am 30 years old, and my father finally said a true thing about me, and I am embarrassed by how much it mattered. Don't tell me it shouldn't matter at my age. I know." Elias wrote back, "It should matter at any age. My father never said a true thing about me in his life. I'd have held it like gold too." She wrote, "What did he say instead?" He wrote, "That I was too slow. That Daniel was the one with the sense for land. That I'd likely never amount to a thing on my own." He paused over this. He'd never written it to anyone. He died before I had the land or the house or the wheat in the ground. I think about that sometimes. Whether it would have changed anything. I've decided it wouldn't, which I think makes it better and worse at the same time. She wrote back one sentence to that. Yes, exactly that. Better and worse at the same time. It was that kind of letter exchange by then. They could finish each other's thoughts, not in the way of people who agreed about everything, but in the way of people who'd been honest enough about their own thinking that the shape of it had become familiar. They disagreed too, and badly sometimes. Margaret said the homestead policy was built on a premise that erased the people already living on the land, and Elias had written back defensively, and she'd held the line, and he'd gone away from that letter tight with irritation, and come back a week later having thought about it and written, "You're right, and I didn't like it, and I've been turning it over, and you're still right." She'd written back, "Thank you." That was hard to get to, I imagine. He'd written, "Don't be gracious about it, it's worse." She'd written, "I know, I am occasionally terrible." He'd written, "Only occasionally." She'd written, "Don't push it." The rhythm of them was real now. It had weight and a pattern, and underneath it was the slow accumulation of everything they'd told each other, everything they'd declined to protect themselves from, all those 2 in the morning honest pages sent over the long dry summer miles. Elias understood that he trusted her, which was not a thing he'd extended to many people in his life, and Margaret understood the same thing from her own side, and neither of them said it directly in those terms because they were both too careful and too smart for that kind of declaration, but it was in every letter, like a water stain you eventually stop noticing because it's been there so long it's just part of the wall now. In August, her father collapsed again, this time worse. The doctor in Asher Falls used the word grave, which was a doctor's way of meaning prepare yourself. And Margaret wrote to Elias from the front room of her parents' house at 11:30 at night, her father stable but altered, her mother asleep in the chair, the print shop closed and dark across town. "I don't know how long this is going to be. I want to be honest with you about that. I am not leaving. I cannot leave. And I don't know if I'll be able to come even when he's better, because better doesn't mean what it used to with his heart, and the shop will need managing for the long term, and my mother cannot do it, and the boys aren't ready. I am writing this at midnight, and I'm tired in the way where you're tired past feeling it, and I think I need to say something to you that I have been careful not to say because it isn't fair to say it when I can't follow it anywhere. I think you know what I mean. I think we both know what the letters have been by now, and I know, that I am asking you to wait for something I cannot make you a promise about, and that is not a thing I have any right to ask. I'm asking anyway, because I don't know what else to do." Elias got that letter on the last day of August, at the end of a hard day that had included a broken axle on the wagon and a run-in with a straying bull that had knocked him sideways into a fence post and left him with a bruised rib and a matching bruise to his dignity. He read it sitting on the porch steps, not in the chairs, with his hat in his hands and the evening coming on. He sat with it a long while. Then he went inside and wrote back. A letter he kept short on purpose because some things get worse the more words you put on them. Margaret, there's nothing you owe me, and there's nothing you need to ask permission for. You are where you need to be, and I know it, and I am not going anywhere. I told you that in March, and I'll tell you in August, and I'll tell you next March if that's where we are. The chair is here. I am here. Take the time. Do what needs doing. And when you're ready, not when it's easy, it won't be easy. When you're ready, the loo is here, and I am here, and the chair is here, and that's all. Don't worry about me. I've been waiting since before I knew what I was waiting for. He sent it the next morning, with the ache in his ribs making every step to town remind him he wasn't a young man anymore. Not as young as he'd started this, and the summer was ending, and the second chair had been empty more than a year. And he waited. That was the whole of what he could do, and he did it. And the prairie turned gold and then brown, and then the frost came and he sat on the porch in the evenings with his coffee and the empty chair beside him and did not once consider moving it. Walt saw it one October afternoon and started to say something and looked at Elias's face and didn't. Some things in a county get past the point of commentary, and this had become one of them. A man and a chair and a woman somewhere east of the grass, holding everything together with the same stubborn hands, waiting for the moment when her life stopped needing all of her at once. The county had stopped laughing at the chair by summer. By fall, though no one said so directly, something in the way people nodded at Elias when he came to town had changed. He couldn't have named the change. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was closer to the way people look at a man walking uphill with a heavy thing, quietly, not offering help because they can see he doesn't need it and might resent the implication. He got a letter from Margaret in November, 1 page, written fast. My father is better. Not well. Better. He came down to the shop yesterday for the first time since August. He set 6 lines of type and had to sit down, and he cried, and I pretended not to see it, which was the kindest thing I could do. The boys are learning the ledgers now. I'm teaching them myself. It is slow. Everything here is slow. I'm sorry. He wrote back, don't apologize. Tell me what 6 lines he set. She wrote back, the classifieds. Small ads for lost dogs and secondhand furniture. He set them like they were the most important type in the world. He wrote back, because they were to him that day. She wrote, yes. And the letters went on through the winter, and the chair sat empty, and Elias Rowan refused every suggestion, every implication, every kindly meant comment about moving on, with the same flat quiet he'd used on Walt in the spring, and the wheat stubble stood in the frozen field waiting for the turn, and 300 miles east a woman put her father's print shop back together with the same hand she'd used to set type in someone else's paper. And neither of them said the word yet. But it was in every letter, silent and patient and absolutely certain, like a chair nobody'd sat in that was already worn to the shape of the person coming. The second winter passed the way the first one had, in letters and cold, and the particular endurance of people who've decided to wait something out and won't be argued from it. But there was a difference in the second winter that Elias felt without being able to name, the way you feel a change in the weather before the clouds have organized themselves into anything you can point at. The letters were the same length, the same frequency, the same 2 a.m. honesty they'd built the whole thing on. But something underneath them had shifted its weight, the way ice shifts in March, not breaking yet, just groaning with the pressure of what's coming. Margaret's father had stabilized through December, not recovered. That word had quietly left the conversation by November, the doctor having made clear that the heart that had served Thomas Hale for 61 years was now a smaller and more cautious organ than it had been, requiring rest and moderation and a willingness to let other people carry what he'd always insisted on carrying himself. Thomas Hale, by all of Margaret's accounting, was not a man naturally suited to that kind of willingness. He'd built the print shop from a single Washington hand press and a borrowed set of type cases, and he'd run it with the particular pride of a self-made man who confused I did this with only I can do this, which was a confusion Margaret had been quietly correcting for years without either of them fully acknowledging it. She wrote to Elias in January. He let me close the books this month without checking them after. He didn't say anything about it, just watched me do it and then went to bed. I think that was the hardest thing he's done since August. Elias wrote back, "Sounds like a man learning something late. That's not nothing." She wrote, "No, it isn't. It costs him, though. You can see it cost him." She didn't say what it was costing her, but Elias had learned to read the spaces in her letters the way he read the spaces in his fields. What wasn't growing told you as much as what was. She was tired. She'd been tired since August, and she was keeping it away from the page because she thought it would read as complaint. And Margaret Hale, he'd come to understand, had been taught somewhere along the way that weariness was self-indulgence, and she hadn't fully unlearned it yet. He wrote, "You're allowed to be tired, Margaret. You don't have to keep that off the page with me." She took 5 days to write back, which was long for her. When the letter came, it was 2 sentences. "I know I don't have to. I'm not sure I know how anymore. Give me time." He gave her time. It was the one thing he had in abundance. By February, the boys, the 2 apprentices, whose names Margaret had given him as Ned and Carl, Ned being 17 and sharp, and Carl being 20 and sweet-natured but slow with the ledger columns, were running the press without her standing over them. The accounts were hers now entirely, not as a temporary arrangement, but as a settled fact that her father had stopped pretending was temporary. The shop ran. It ran because Margaret made it run. And by March, even Thomas Hale had stopped framing this as a situation and started framing it as the way things were, which was its own kind of gift, however late arriving. And then in April, Margaret wrote a letter that was different from all the others in a way Elias felt in his chest before he'd finished the first paragraph. It started ordinarily enough, a description of a composing error Carl had made that had rendered funeral arrangements as furniture arrangements in an obituary, which had caused a problem that Margaret described with the dry economy of a woman who'd seen the full range of human error and placed this one in the middle. But then it turned, the way her letters sometimes turned when she'd been building toward something for several paragraphs and had finally run out of runway. "I've been thinking about the chair." That was all she said on the subject, in that letter. Just that one sentence, dropped into the middle of a paragraph and then moved past, like she'd set it down and kept walking. Elias read it 3 times. He put the letter on the kitchen table and cooked his supper and ate it, looking at the letter and didn't touch it again until he'd done the dishes, which was a kind of discipline he needed because if he answered it too fast, he'd answer it wrong. He wrote back, "I think about it too." She wrote, "I know you do. I think I've been using my father as the reason not to, when the real reason is that I'm afraid. That's hard to write. I'm writing it anyway." He wrote, "What are you afraid of?" She took a week. Then, that I've built the whole thing in my head out of letters, and now it's a perfect thing that would break the moment it met the actual world. That I've fallen in love with a correspondence and not a man. That I'll step off the train and look at you and realize I've been talking to a version of you I made up. And you've been talking to a version of me you made up, and the 2 of us will have nothing to say to each other in person. That I'll have given up everything familiar for a beautiful idea that was only ever beautiful because it stayed on paper. Elias sat with that letter for 3 days. He wasn't good at the kind of reassurance that would have been easy to offer here. Of course it'll be fine. Of course we'll be the same in person. Because he didn't know that, and she'd have seen through it if he'd tried, and they'd built this whole thing on not offering comfort that wasn't earned. So he sat with it until he had something true instead of something easy. He wrote, "You're right that we might not be who we are on paper. I think about that too. I think we're probably each worse in some ways, and I know I'm worse in person than in a letter because I'm slow to talk and I get short when I'm tired and I have been known to be wrong without saying so for longer than I should. But here's the thing, Margaret. Everything you've told me you are. The part that sees through things, the part that doesn't back down, the part that ran your father's shop back from the edge without letting anyone lean on you too hard. Those are not things that live on paper. Those are things a person is. You can't write a kindness you don't have. You can't write a spine you don't have. I know who you are. I know it the way I know what my field's going to do in a wet spring. Not because I have proof yet, but because I've been watching it long enough to read it. Come if you want to. But don't come afraid." She wrote back one line, "I'll need to get the shop stable enough to leave for a real stretch. Give me until June." He wrote back one line, "Take until October if you need it. I'll be here." She didn't take until October. She wrote again in May, which Elias had not let himself expect, and the letter was short and practical and completely unlike her usual voice, which told him she'd made a decision and was now in the mode of executing it rather than examining it, because examining it would stop her. The boys can handle the press. My father is managing the accounts with Ned looking over his shoulder, which he hates, but it's working. Enright woman from next door to come in mornings. I have bought a train ticket. I will be on the Union Pacific out of Asher Falls on the 14th of June, arriving in Greer on the 16th, assuming the line holds and the weather's civil. I don't know what I'm doing. I know I'm doing it. Don't make a fuss. Elias read that on a Wednesday morning, standing at the general delivery window, and he stood there long enough that the postmaster asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. He walked out to his wagon and sat in it for 10 minutes without picking up the reins. June 14th, 5 weeks. He drove home thinking about everything that needed doing to the house, which was a way of not thinking about the fact that in 5 weeks, a woman he'd written to for 14 months and never seen would step off a train in Greer, Nebraska, and he would be standing there, and whatever happened next would happen in real time, out loud, with no days to think before answering. He spent the next 5 weeks in a state of productive terror that he channeled entirely into the house. He replanked 2 sections of the porch floor that had started to go soft. He patched the parlor wall where water had found the seam last winter. He bought a proper cook stove to replace the cast iron box he'd been nursing for 2 years, spending money he'd planned to put toward the fall seed, and he stood in the kitchen looking at it for a long time after he'd got it in and leveled, thinking about the meals he'd cooked alone on the old one and feeling strange about the stove and about himself. Walt noticed, because Walt noticed everything. He came by in early June, ostensibly about a fence line dispute that Elias suspected was not urgent, and stood in the yard looking at the house with the fresh plank sections on the porch. "She's coming," Walt said. "Yes." "When?" 16th. Walt was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark was going off in the field, and the sky was enormous and pale blue, the way it got in June before the real heat settled in. "You need anything?" Walt asked, and it came out rough the way Walt's kind things always did, like they'd been sanded too fast. "I'm fine." "Marthy wants to know if she should—" Walt." Elias looked at him. "Tell Marthy I appreciate it. Tell her to give us a week before she comes calling, just the 1 week. Walt nodded, resettled his hat, and left without another word, which was Walt's version of discretion and not the worst version Elias had ever seen. The morning of the 16th came the way mornings come in Nebraska in June. Fast, the sun up before you're ready, the light already white and pressing. Elias was up at 4 without the alarm, which was how he knew he hadn't really slept. He ate breakfast he didn't taste, and hitched the wagon and drove the 3 hours to Greer, arriving 2 hours before the train was due, which meant he stood on the platform in the heat with his hat in his hands and his good shirt on, which he'd pressed himself with moderate success, and waited. The platform filled up around him. A family meeting someone, a man with crates being loaded, the station master and his dog walking the length of the boards. Elias stood where he was. He'd told Margaret he'd be on the platform and she'd know him by the hat, which was the one Pole had once told him was not the hat of a man who'd given the matter any thought, which was true. It was just a hat. He held it in his hands now so she could see his face. The train was 20 minutes late, which was 20 minutes in which he had nothing to do but stand there and think, which he'd been trying to avoid. He thought about Daniel. He thought about his father, the things he'd said and the things he hadn't. He thought about the ad, the 4 terrible sentences that Pole had fixed the spelling on and left the rest of, and he tried to remember if he'd known, writing it, that it would lead here, and he decided honestly that he hadn't. He'd known he was building against the silence. He hadn't known what the building would make. He heard the train before he saw it, the whistle over the flat land, then the smoke, then the iron grinding down the track to the platform, and the sound and the heat of it came in together, and the passengers started to appear on the steps of the cars, and Elias watched each one and felt his heart going in a way he resented and couldn't stop. She was in the 3rd car. He knew her before she'd finished coming down the steps, which should have been strange given that he'd never seen her, but wasn't. The square-set way she held herself, a little braced, the look on her face that was taking everything in and giving nothing away yet. All of it was exactly the person he'd been reading for 14 months, and he understood in that moment that she'd been right to worry and wrong to worry, both at once, because the letters and the person were the same, and also not the same. And the difference was that the person was more compressed, more watchful, more alive than words on a page could hold. She had a traveling bag in one hand and a hat in the other. She'd taken it off, he'd find out later, because the train had been hot and airless, and she wasn't going to meet anyone sweating under a hat. And she was scanning the platform with those dark eyes, systematically, the way you set type, left to right, and then she found him. She stopped. He was already walking toward her. They came to a stop about 4 feet apart, which was the distance of strangers, and they stood there, and the platform noise went on around them, and neither of them said anything for a moment that felt very long and was probably 3 seconds. Then Elias said, "Your train was late." 20 minutes, she said. The line through Denton held water from the rains last week. I heard that. You've been here a while. 2 hours. She looked at him with the expression she'd use on a composing error that she'd already fixed and was now deciding whether to find funny. You said you'd be here. You didn't say you'd be here 2 hours early. I didn't want to be late. You couldn't have been late. There's only one train. I know that now, he said. I didn't know how long the drive was going to feel. She was quiet a moment. Her eyes had a quality he'd expected from the letters. Nothing slid past them. And they were doing something careful now, reading him the way she'd read his letters, looking for the seam between the performed version and the real one. He let her look. He'd learned not to flinch from it on paper, and he wasn't going to start flinching in person. Well, she said finally, you look like your handwriting. He blinked. I don't know what that means. Functional, she said. No extra strokes. And something at the corner of her mouth did what a smile does when a person is too tired and too wound up to fully commit to one. Is that good? He asked. I'm here, she said. Decide for yourself. He took her bag. She didn't argue about it, which surprised him, and then she said, I'm not letting you carry it because I can't. I'm letting you carry it because I've been carrying it since yesterday morning, and I'm done with it. Which was Margaret all the way through, making sure no kindness went misattributed. He understood it was her way of saying she wasn't fragile and didn't want to be handled like she was, and he filed that away, first fact learned in person, consistent with everything she'd ever written. They walked to the wagon. She looked at it without comment, which he suspected was its own comment, and climbed up without help, which he suspected was the same comment. He went around and got up beside her and picked up the reins, and they pulled out of Greer into the long, flat road west, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the prairie opened out around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of things that don't know they're being looked at. It's bigger than I pictured, Margaret said. People say that. How long until I stop feeling like the sky's going to fall on me? Couple weeks, he said. Maybe more. You get used to the size of it, and then one day you can't remember why it bothered you. Does that happen with all of it? The isolation? He thought about it honestly, which she'd expect. No, he said. The isolation stays hard. You just find things to do with it. She turned and looked at him with a directness that was briefly startling. In the letters he'd been used to her honesty, but on paper honesty has a delay. You could prepare for it, and in person it arrived without warning. Is that what the letters were? She asked. Something to do with the isolation? At first, he said. Then they were something else. What? You know what, he said. He wasn't going to perform at her. She looked back at the road. I know, she said, quieter. I was asking if you'd say it. Did I pass? Provisionally, she said, and this time the smile finished itself, briefly, and then was gone. She was not a person who smiled at nothing, he could already see, and that meant the ones she gave were real, and that seemed right. The road ran on. The grassland moved in the wind the way it always did, like a slow breathing, and the sun was high, and the light was the kind that didn't cast much shadow yet. Elias had done this drive 100 times in 2 years and never minded it, and he minded it less now, though something in him was coiled tight with the awareness of her beside him on the bench, the actual person, the weight and presence of her, after so many months of only words. He said, after a while, Are you afraid still? She considered this with the seriousness she gave everything. Yes, she said. Just less than I was this morning. What changed? You said your train was late, she said, like I was already expected, like you'd already fit me into the tense of the sentence. He'd never thought about it that way. He turned it over. I suppose you were, he said. By then. By then, she repeated. She looked at her hands in her lap, the ink stains at the edges of her fingers that the train journey hadn't faded. My mother cried, she said abruptly. When I left, not because she thought I was wrong, she said so. She said she thought I was finally doing the right-sized thing. She still cried. I stood on the platform in Asher Falls and watched her cry and got on the train anyway, and that was the hardest thing I've done in my life. And I've had some hard years. I know you have, he said. I know you know. She paused. That helps. More than it should, probably. They drove on. The wind had picked up slightly, and the grass was rolling in long waves out to the west, and Elias could smell the particular dry heat of the land in June. The smell he'd stopped noticing the way you stop noticing your own house until someone new walks in and tells you what it smells like. He tried to smell it now with her beside him, to notice what she was arriving into. Does it smell like anything to you? He asked. The land, she breathed in, deliberate, the way she did everything. Dry grass, she said, and heat, and something underneath, like the ground's been holding something for a long time and can't decide whether to let it go. She paused. That might be too much. No, he said. That's about right. They arrived at the house in the mid-afternoon, when the light was coming in low and golden from the west, which was the one time of day the house looked genuinely good, Elias had always thought, though it looked decent enough the rest of the time. He pulled up in the yard and they sat a moment before getting down. She was looking at the porch. The two chairs were there exactly as he'd described them, the bur oak going silver at the edges now with 2 years of weather, the right one worn at the arms where his hands had rested all those evenings. The left one wore no marks like that. It looked like what it was, a chair that had been built and kept and never used. You didn't change anything, she said. No. You kept it exactly like the ad said. I didn't keep it like the ad said, he said. I kept it because it was true. The ad was just the way I got the true thing to you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's a better sentence than anything you wrote in the letters. You make me think faster, he said. On paper, I have time to get slow. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the afternoon light was what it was, unhelpful and honest. And they were just two people in a wagon yard in Nebraska with a porch and 2 chairs and 14 months of words between them, and the gap between what they'd built on paper and what they'd have to build in the actual world was real and wide and going to take real work. He got down and got her bag. She got down on her own side and stood in the yard and looked at the house the way she'd looked at the wagon, straight on, taking it in. He watched her take it in and did not try to explain or excuse any of it. The house was what it was. He was what he was. She walked up the porch steps and stopped in front of the left chair and looked at it for a long moment. The way you look at something you've thought about for a long time and are finally standing in front of. Then she sat down in it, not tentatively, not carefully. She just sat down. The way you sit in a chair you've decided is yours, settled her hands on the arms, and looked out at the grassland going gold in the evening light, and the wind came across it the same as always, and the chair moved on its runners. He'd built them right. They moved easy. And she rocked once, slowly, and he stood at the edge of the porch and looked at her in the chair, and something in him that had been holding its breath for 2 years let it go. She didn't look at him. She kept looking out at the prairie. You built them level, she said. Both of them. They're the exact same height. I measured, he said. Of course you did. She rocked again. Sit down, Elias. You're standing there like you're waiting to be dismissed. He sat in his chair. The two of them rocked in silence, which was not empty silence, not the kind that had got into him before the letters, but the other kind, full, specific, the silence of two people who had already said most of what they needed to say and were now sitting with the weight of it, comfortable in a way that couldn't be manufactured. After a while she said, I'm going to be difficult to live with. I know, he said. I mean it. I have strong opinions about the accounts. I'll want to change your filing system within a month. I'm not easy to argue with. I'm not easy to argue with either, he said. I get quiet when I'm angry, which is worse. Yes, she said, it is worse. We'll figure it out. We might not, she said, not cruelly, practically, the way she handled everything. We might be two people who were better in letters than in the same house. We might be, he agreed. That doesn't scare you? He thought about the question the way he thought about everything she asked him, straight at it, no flinching. It does, he said, but I built the chair before I knew you were real, and I kept it empty when I had every reason to think you weren't coming, and I figure a man who's done those two things already used up his scared. Mostly. She considered that. The prairie moved. Somewhere out in the grass a bird called once and then was quiet. Mostly, she said. Mostly, he said. The sun went down in the west the way it did out here, the whole horizon going red and then purple, and then the first stars coming fast in that enormous sky. And the two of them sat on the porch in their chairs, his worn and hers unworn, and the runners exactly the same height because he'd measured, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, and there was nothing missing from the silence. It had been 2 years since he'd built those chairs, 14 months since the letter with the square handwriting arrived. And now she was here, in the chair, in the actual world, with all the difficulty and uncertainty that the actual world required. And it was not beautiful the way things are in stories. It was harder than that and more real than that, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Margaret Hale sat in the empty chair, and it wasn't empty anymore. And Elias Rowan looked at the prairie he'd staked his whole impossible bet on, and the wind came down off the flat land and rocked both chairs gently on their runners, and the stars came out one by one over Nebraska, and the silence between two people who had earned each other was the best kind of silence there is, the kind that doesn't need filling, because it already is. Marriage, it turned out, was nothing like correspondence. Elias had known this intellectually, the way you know a river is cold before you step in it, and knowing it didn't stop the cold from being cold. They married in September, 3 months after Margaret's arrival, in Pole's newspaper office because it was the largest indoor space in Greer that wasn't the saloon, and Pole had offered it with the gruff sentimentality of a man who'd set the original ad in type and felt some proprietary interest in the outcome. Walt Cady stood up for Elias. Margaret had written to a woman named Clara Birch in Asher Falls, a compositor's widow she'd known for years, and Clara had made the trip west for it, arriving on the same train line Margaret had taken 3 months before, looking around at the flat country with an expression that said she understood now why Margaret's letters had sounded different. The ceremony was short. The justice of the peace was a man named Aldous Hicks, who read from a card he'd used so many times the edges were soft, and Elias said the words in his flat, careful way, and Margaret said them in hers, which was cleaner and faster, and they put the rings on, plain silver, bought in Greer, nothing ornate, and Pole's wife cried, which surprised everyone, including Pole's wife, and Walt shook Elias's hand so hard it ached for 2 days. Afterward, eating the food Marthy Cady had brought in covered dishes without being asked, Clara pulled Margaret aside near the window and said quietly, "He looks at you the way a man looks at a thing he built himself and still can't quite believe holds." "He didn't build me," Margaret said. "I know that," Clara said. "That's why it's worth something." The first year was the education. Elias knew land. He knew weather and soil and the temperament of animals and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a ranch alive through the seasons. What he did not know, and had not known he didn't know, was how poorly organized his own operation was until Margaret sat down with his papers in October and went quiet in the particular way she went quiet when she was working, which was very quiet, and then looked up and said, "Elias, you have been running this on instinct and luck, and you've been lucky, and the luck is going to run out." He sat down across from her. "How bad?" "Not bad," she said, which he heard correctly as not yet bad. "But you have no records going back more than 18 months. You don't know which of your fields has turned the most consistent yield over time. You don't know your actual cost per acre on the new wheat because you haven't tracked the inputs against the outputs. You've been making decisions on feel. Feel has kept it running. Feel got you this far," she said. "Feel won't scale." They had their first real argument that night. Not a bad one, but a genuine one, with raised voices and the particular quality of friction that comes when two people who are both right about different parts of a thing try to occupy the same space. Elias said he'd kept the ranch alive for 4 years without a ledger system, and he knew his land better than any column of numbers could tell him. Margaret said knowing your land and knowing your operation were not the same thing, and that every homestead she'd watched fail in the county news back in Asher Falls had failed because the man running it knew the land fine and the money not at all. He went out and walked the fence line in the dark, which was what he did with anger. Walked it out, gave it the land to absorb. She stayed at the table and kept working, because that was what she did with anger, which was use it. When he came back, she had 3 pages of notes and a proposed record-keeping system that was simple enough that he could maintain it himself, which told him she'd understood what the argument was actually about. Not whether records were useful, but whether he was capable of the records. And she'd answered that before he'd asked it. He sat down and looked at the pages. "This is straightforward," he said. "I know it is." "You made it that way on purpose?" "Yes." He looked at her. She looked back, level, waiting. She wasn't apologizing for being right, and she wasn't softening it. He found he didn't want her to. "All right," he said. "Show me how it works." They spent the next 2 months building the system together. Elias supplying everything he carried in his head about the land and the animals and the yields, Margaret translating it into paper that would hold. It was slow and sometimes frustrating. He had a way of skipping steps that seemed obvious to him and opaque to anyone else, and she had a way of wanting categories that covered every contingency, which drove him slightly mad. But by December they had something that was genuinely useful and genuinely theirs. Neither his rough intuition alone, nor her pure system alone, but a combination that had the best of both and some original thing besides. Walt came over for coffee in December, looked at the ledger system on the table, picked it up and turned a page. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "We made it," Elias said. Walt put it down. He said nothing to Margaret directly, which was Walt's limitation and not meanness, but he nodded at the table in a way that she understood was meant for her and that she accepted without comment, because she'd learned already that Walt Cady's nods were doing the work his words couldn't. The first hard year was 1884. The summer came in hot and stayed, and by July the creek had dropped to a trickle, and the smaller homesteads south of the Lou were already in trouble. The Bruder place, old Friedrich Bruder, who'd plowed his field the spring after losing his 3 children and never stopped plowing, went dry by August, and Bruder started talking about pulling out for Kansas, and Elias listened to this at the general store with his jaw tight. He came home and told Margaret, and she listened the way she always listened to things that required thinking, completely, no interruption, her eyes on the middle distance. "How much water do we have?" she asked. "Enough? The well's deep? The creek's low, but it's running." "How much is enough for the animals?" He thought about it. "Through the end of the season, maybe a little past." "Could we run Bruder's animals on our water? If he left the stock with us and came back in the spring?" He blinked. That's a lot of stock to carry through winter." "I know. Could we do it?" He worked through it while she watched him, counting animals in his head against the water and the feed supply. "Tight," he said. "It'd be tight, but possible." "Possibly possible," he said, which was not a phrase he'd ever used and which made her almost smile, which was not nothing. They went to Bruder, who was a man hollowed out by losses and too proud to ask for what he needed, and Elias made the offer as flat and practical as he could. No charity in the phrasing, just a neighbor arrangement that happened to benefit the Rowan operation in the spring if the animals came through the winter in good condition. Bruder stood in his yard and looked at them, both of them, Elias and Margaret standing side by side, and something in his leathered face moved. "I'll pay what I can in the spring," Bruder said. "I know you will," Elias said. "Don't worry about it before then." The winter was hard, as winters always were, and carrying Bruder's animals was harder than the tide Elias had estimated, which Margaret had expected and didn't mention because there was no use in being right about a hard thing once you'd already committed to it. They lost 2 of Bruder's heifers to the cold in February, and Elias took that hard in the way he took losses, quiet, drawn in, walking the fence line after dark. Margaret waited, and when he came back in she had coffee and didn't ask him to talk about it, and he loved her for that specific thing, which he told her, which surprised them both because Elias was not a man who said things like that out loud. "You don't have to say it," she said, looking at her cup. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." She looked up. "Don't make a habit of it. I'll start expecting it." "Maybe that wouldn't be the worst thing," he said. She held his gaze a moment. No, she said. Maybe not. Bruder came back in April. He paid what he'd said he would, not everything Elias had put in but honest, and he stood in the yard looking at his surviving stock with the expression of a man counting gifts he hadn't deserved, and knew it. He started to say something and stopped. Same offer stands next dry summer, Elias said. If it comes to it. Bruder looked at him and then at Margaret, who was on the porch with the account book. The both of you, he said. You're a different kind of operation. We're trying to be, Margaret said from the porch. Bruder nodded once and drove his stock home. It was Margaret's idea, the library. Elias never would have come to it on his own, not because he didn't understand the value of books. He'd come to understand the value of books through that long winter of Middlemarch and everything she'd mailed him since. But because it wouldn't have occurred to him that the thing a settlement like theirs was missing was a place where people could read things other than seed catalogs and the Beacon. She came to it, she said, by watching the women of the county at the general store, how they talked to each other in those 10 minutes between purchases, how hungry the talk was, how much they wanted something to have an opinion about that wasn't weather or crop prices. She put it to Elias one evening in the second year, a thing she'd been developing for weeks by the way she said it. Fully formed, no trial balloon. I want to start a lending library, she said. Out of the front room. We don't use it for anything. The front room of our house, he said. It's the largest space on this claim, and it's warm and the porch is covered so people can come in bad weather. She had a list in front of her, which meant she'd already costed it out. I've priced the initial collection. 40 books to start, mix of practical and fiction, and 2 periodicals. I'll catalog them and lend them on a 2-week rotation and ask for a small subscription that covers the cost of replacing what gets damaged. He looked at the list. The numbers were tight but real. When did you work this out? Over winter. She paused. I need something that's mine out here. The ranch accounts are ours. This would be mine. He heard what she was saying underneath it, and he took it seriously, which she needed, which he knew. She'd come from a life where she'd been the most capable person in every room and had learned to make herself smaller for it, and the ranch was better for her being in it. But it was still his ranch that she'd come into, still his fields and his neighbors and his county that she was building herself a life inside of. She needed a thing she'd made herself, in the same way the empty chair had been his thing, made first. Use the front room, he said. Tell me what you need built. He built 2 long shelves on the front room wall that fall. Not pretty work, but solid. And Margaret ordered the books through a catalog out of Omaha and arranged them with a system she'd invented that was faster to navigate than alphabetical for people who didn't always know the title or the author, but knew they'd wanted something like the last one. The library opened, if you could call it that. She just told 3 women at the store, and word moved the way word moved in a county this size, in October, and by the end of the first month 11 families had subscribed, which was more than she'd projected, and which she noted in the account book with the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd been right about a thing she'd had to argue for. It changed things in ways that were hard to account for in the ledgers. Women started coming who hadn't been to the Rowan place before, and they came for the books and stayed an hour talking on the porch, and the talk was different from general store talk, more wide open, more argument, more the way people talked when they felt like their opinions were being taken seriously. Some of the men came too, quietly, saying they were picking up for their wives, and then standing at the shelves long enough that it was clear they were picking for themselves. Old Henslow, the man 2 claims over who'd gone silent over the years, showed up one November afternoon without his wife, who'd left for Missouri, without any stated reason, holding his hat and looking at the shelves with the expression of a man who didn't know how to ask for what he wanted. Margaret watched him for a moment, then said, "Do you like history or story?" He looked at her. "Story," he said. It was the first word Elias had heard him use in 2 years. She pulled a book without hesitation, handed it to him, and told him 2 weeks and the subscription was 20 cents for the season. He paid the 20 cents and left with the book, and came back in 2 weeks for another one, and started talking again, slowly, the way a man relearns a skill he thought he'd lost, and the county noticed but didn't make a fuss of it, because these things are fragile when they're first coming back. You figured it about right, Elias told Margaret one evening. They were on the porch, the fall air cold enough that they'd each brought a blanket, the chairs rocking in the easy rhythm they'd fallen into over the months. Figured what right? That the women needed something to have opinions about. Everyone needed something, she said. Not just the women. The women were just the more obvious case. He thought about that. Henslow. Henslow, she said, and 4 of the men who came in saying they were picking up for their wives and weren't. He was quiet a moment, looking out at the prairie going dark at the edges. You're better at seeing people than I am. You see the land better than I do, she said. You've got eyes for what a field needs before it knows it needs it. I've got eyes for what a person needs before they'll admit to it. We cover the ground between us. He thought about the phrase, cover the ground between us, and how true it was, and how it was not the kind of truth he'd have found without her there to name it. He reached across the space between the chairs and put his hand over hers on the arm of her chair, and she didn't pull back, which was not guaranteed with Margaret, and therefore always meant something. The wheat's looking good for next spring, he said after a while. I know. I ran the numbers. I know you did. It's the best projection we've had since I started keeping the books. I know that too. She squeezed his hand once, briefly, and let it go. Don't be smug about it. I'm not being smug, he said. I'm being satisfied. There's a difference. Very slim one, she said. But real, he said. But real, she agreed. The ranch that had run on feel and luck in Elias's first years was something different now, not unrecognizable. The bones of it were his, the land and the animals and the stubborn wheat variety that had proved itself through 2 dry seasons. But layered over with Margaret's systems and Margaret's precision, and the particular way a thing works better when 2 people's strengths are allowed to each do what they're for. The county had watched it happen, the way a county watches everything, sideways, without openly admitting it's watching. And the judgment had shifted quietly from Rowan's fool porch chairs to something that didn't have a clean name, but lived in the nods people gave him at the store and the way women asked Margaret's opinion at the library and meant it. Walt came by one afternoon in the second fall to help bring in a fence post that had heaved in the frost, and when they'd done it, he stood in the yard and looked at the house and the porch and the library window where you could see the shelf of books through the glass Margaret had insisted they put in the front room. And he said, not looking at Elias, Marthy said to tell you she was wrong. About what specifically? Elias said. Walt's wife had been wrong about several things over the years, in the way of a woman whose opinions were strong and various. About the chair, Walt said, about what it meant. She said she thought it was grief when she first heard about it, and she said to tell you she was wrong. He picked up his hat from the fence post. She's not wrong about much. She takes it hard when she is. Tell her she doesn't owe me anything, Elias said. She knows that, Walt said. That's why she wanted to say it. He drove home. Elias stood in the yard looking at the porch, the 2 chairs out there in the late light, both of them worn now, both of them carrying the marks of the seasons and the use, the difference between them small enough that you'd have to look close to see it anymore. He stood there a while in the way of a man who has more to be grateful for than he'd known how to want when he started, and doesn't quite know what to do with the fact that the thing he built first, the thing everyone laughed at, turned out to be the most essential thing of all. Margaret came to the door. You're standing in the cold, she said. I know it. Are you coming in? In a minute. She looked at him. Walt say something to you? His wife wanted him to pass something on. Something kind? From Marthy Katie, he said. So yes. Eventually. Margaret leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed against the cold. She looked at the chairs, and then at the land, and then at him. We should put another coat of oil on those runners before winter. I know, he said. I'll do it this week. I could do it. You could, he said. But I built them. I'll do it. She went back inside. He stood in the yard another minute in the last light, with the prairie spread out around the house in every direction, and it was not the silent thing it had been. It was full now, of her voice and her books and her ledgers and her particular way of looking at a thing until she understood it and then saying so. And the silence that remained was the good kind, the productive kind, the kind a man can rest in because it has room for another person's breathing. He went inside. She had the lamp lit and the stove going and the account book open on the table, running next spring's numbers in the margins the way she did when she was thinking through something larger. And he sat across from her and they worked in the comfortable parallel of 2 people who had each learned the other's silences and no longer needed to fill them. And the night came down over Nebraska and the chairs sat on the porch, and the library books waited in the front room, and the wheat slept in the ground under the frost, stubborn-rooted and patient, waiting for the turn of the season the way everything out here waited. Not helplessly, but with the particular confidence of a thing that had been planted right and knew the spring was coming. The years did what years do. They accumulated without announcing themselves, each one folding into the next so gradually that you only noticed the distance when you turned around and looked back at how far you'd come from where you started. The lending library outgrew the front room by the 5th year. Margaret had expanded the collection to 240 volumes by then, plus 4 periodicals and a rotating selection of agricultural pamphlets that Elias had initially thought was her way of educating him indirectly, and that turned out to be the most borrowed items in the collection, which neither of them mentioned to the other for different reasons. She moved the overflow to a dedicated shelf in the barn annex, which was not ideal and which she complained about with the specific frustration of a woman who can see exactly what the solution is and is waiting for the resources to match the vision. The solution arrived in the form of a small separate building, 12 by 16 feet, lumber. Elias cut himself over one winter, shelves Margaret designed and he built to her specifications, a window on the south wall for light that went up in the spring of their 6th year together, and that the county immediately started calling the Rowan Library as if it had always been there and always had a name. They had 2 children. The first, a boy named Thomas after Margaret's father, arrived in the 4th year and was a difficult infant who screamed at the dark and refused to sleep until Margaret, in a state of exhausted pragmatism, started reading to him from the county land records, which were the most boring document she had on hand, and which worked, and which became a family story told at every subsequent gathering until Thomas was old enough to be embarrassed by it, and then old enough to find it funny again. The second, a girl they named Clara after the compositor's widow, who'd come from Asher Falls for the wedding, arrived 2 years after Thomas and was so unlike her brother in temperament, quiet, watchful, content, that Margaret said she felt she'd ordered a correction from some department that handled these things. And Elias said that was not how it worked, and Margaret said she knew that. It was a figure of speech. And Elias said he knew it was a figure of speech. He just thought it was a strange one. And they had the kind of argument that is really just 2 tired parents talking to each other at the end of a long day, which is its own kind of intimacy when you're used to the alternative. The ranch grew, not dramatically, not the way the papers back east wrote about Western land development with the breathless optimism of people who'd never seen a Nebraska drought, but steadily, the way things grow when they're tended by people who understand the difference between a good year and a trend. Elias's hard-husked wheat proved itself through 3 dry summers, and one that was wet enough to rot an ordinary root system. And by the early 1890s, 2 neighboring ranchers had asked him for seed and for advice, which he gave plainly and without theater because he didn't know how to give advice any other way. Margaret's ledger system had, by then, been adopted by 4 other operations in the county, a fact she discovered secondhand through Walt's wife, and mentioned to Elias with the restraint of a woman who had learned not to say, "I told you too often," because it lost its power. They argued throughout all of it, about money and about priorities and about how much time Elias spent on the far field in the early mornings, when Margaret needed him to help with something at the house, and about how much time Margaret spent on the library accounts when Elias thought the ranch accounts were more urgent, and about the children, and about the neighbors, and about everything couples argue about when they've been together long enough to stop being careful about each other's feelings, which sounds like damage but is actually just the absence of performance, the thing that's left when 2 people have stopped needing to convince each other they're worth keeping. They were not always kind to each other. They were not consistently patient. There were winters where the house felt small in the way that had nothing to do with its square footage and everything to do with 2 strong personalities compressing against each other in the cold. Elias still went quiet when he was angry, which was still worse than shouting, and Margaret still won arguments by being right, which was also sometimes worse than shouting. But they always came back to the porch. That was the thing that held, through the difficult winters and the hard conversations, and the years that accumulated their ordinary griefs. Thomas's scarlet fever at 7, which he survived but which turned Elias's hair gray at the temples in 1 month. The letter from Asher Falls saying Margaret's father had finally lost his long negotiation with his own heart. The drought of '94 that took the brooder place for good this time. Old Friedrich gone to his sister in Illinois with nothing but what fit in a wagon. Through all of it, they came back to the porch in the evenings, when the day was done and the children were settled and the lamp was lit inside, and they sat in the two chairs that were both worn now, both marked by years and use, and they looked at the prairie, and they talked, or they didn't talk, and either way, it was all right. It was on the porch, on a September evening in 1903, that Elias told her his knee had been wrong for 2 months, and he'd seen the doctor in Greer. She went still in the way she went still for serious things. And the doctor says it's the joint, says it's been grinding bone on bone and the damage is done, and the question now is managing it. Managing it how? Less of what I do, he said. Slower. With help. She was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm, the prairie gold in the late light, the kind of September evening that made the whole hard summer feel like it had been worth it. Thomas can take on more, she said. He's been ready for 2 years and you know it. I know it. You haven't let him. I know that too. She looked at him, and the look was not without sympathy, but it was honest, which was the only kind of look she'd ever given him. You did the same thing my father did, she said, held on past when you needed to. He didn't argue it. He'd been thinking the same thing for 2 months since the doctor's office, and he'd been turning it over the same way he turned over hard truths slowly until they lay flat enough to live with. Your father came around eventually, he said. He did, she said. You're faster than he was. That's something. Thomas was 20 by then, built more like Margaret's side of the family than Elias's, lean and quick thinking, with his mother's eyes for systems and his father's eyes for land, which was a combination that made Elias slightly in awe of his own son in a way he'd have died before admitting. He brought Thomas in that fall and handed over the field management with the directness he'd always used for hard things. Plain, no ceremony, just the facts of what was needed and the trust that the boy could handle them. And Thomas took it with the seriousness of a young man who had been waiting for this and didn't want to look like he'd been waiting. You'll tell me if I'm getting it wrong, Thomas said. You'll know before I do, Elias said. But yes, Clara, at 18, had already been running the library for a year, having absorbed the cataloging system from Margaret, the way children absorb things from their parents, so gradually that neither of them could say when the teaching had become the doing. She had Margaret's precision and her father's stubbornness, and a quality neither of them had quite identified until old Henslow, who'd become a faithful library patron over the years, and who talked more with each passing season, said one afternoon that Clara Rowan made a person feel like whatever they wanted to read was exactly the right thing to want, which was rarer than most people knew. Margaret told Elias that in the evening, on the porch. He sat with it a moment. That's you, he said. She got that from you. She got it from watching the library work, Margaret said. The library is yours too. The library is yours, he said. I built the shelves. You built the building. You filled it. She looked at him. We covered the ground between us, she said, using the phrase she'd used years before, and he remembered it from when she'd said it, and she knew he did. We did, he said. The years after Thomas took the fields were different in their texture, but not their substance. Elias's world contracted some. The far field became Thomas's field. The early mornings became slower. But what was left was still his, still the land and the animals, and the particular way the prairie moved in different weathers that he'd been reading for 20 years and never finished reading. He helped where his knee allowed and stepped back where it didn't, and found, over the years, that stepping back was harder than any physical work he'd ever done. And also that Thomas never needed the things Elias had braced himself to be needed for, which was both a relief and the particular sadness of a man discovering he is less indispensable than he'd built his identity around being. Margaret watched this process with the careful eyes she kept for things that mattered and didn't mention it directly, which was her form of grace. The equivalent of his going quiet being worse than shouting, but in the other direction. She found other ways to put him in the frame, asked his opinion on the wheat rotation that she could have reasoned out herself. Had him read the difficult correspondence with the county land office because he knew the official names and precedents she didn't. Small things. Not charity. She'd have scorned charity and he'd have seen through it. Just the architecture of a life they were restructuring without making it look like loss. He knew what she was doing. He never said so. That was its own form of grace. In the spring of 1907, Elias had a bad fall in the barn. The knee, uneven ground, the particular sequence of small misjudgments that produces serious accidents, and spent 6 weeks in the house while the bone healed improperly and then healed again. He was 57 years old, and the 6 weeks were the longest of his life, longer than the first winter alone, longer than the months waiting for Margaret's letters, because this was a confinement without the productive purpose of waiting. Just stillness imposed by his own body, which he resented with everything he had. Margaret sat with him on the porch every evening during those weeks. She brought the account book and worked beside him and read to him from the library books when he'd exhaust his patience for the accounts, which was faster than he'd have admitted before the accident. She read him history mostly, which he liked better than he'd expected, the actual account of things that had happened, the texture of events in the past that explained things in the present. She read well. She'd been reading aloud to library patrons' children for years and had developed the ease of it. And he sat in his chair with his leg propped and listened, and the evenings were long and the prairie was as always, and it was not the worst 6 weeks of his life by the end of it. One evening she stopped reading mid-chapter and said without preamble, "I want to write something." He waited. Not for the library, not an account book. Something, "I want to write what this place has been, what we've built here. While I remember it clearly, while we're both still here to remember it together." He looked at her. The lamp was burning on the porch now that they'd had electricity run from the generator Thomas had installed, and it lit her face differently than the old oil lamp had, and she was 60 years old and he could see exactly who she'd been at 38 stepping off the train with her hat in her hand, looking at him with those reading eyes, and also who she'd been in all the years between. And he thought it was a strange thing to see a whole life in a person's face and be grateful for the sight. "What would you write?" he asked. "The truth of it," she said, "not the pretty version, the drought years, the brooder place, your father and your brother, my father, the argument we had about the ledger system." She paused. "The ad, the letters, the chair." "The chair," he said. "It should be written down," she said. "Not because it's important to anyone else, because it was ours and I don't want to forget any piece of it." He was quiet a moment. "You won't forget it," he said. "You remember everything." "I won't always," she said, and that was the only time in 23 years he'd heard her acknowledge her own mortality directly, and it landed in the evening air between them and stayed there. "Then write it," he said. "Start tonight if you want." She didn't start that night. She finished the chapter first because Margaret didn't leave things in the middle. But she started the next evening, and after that she wrote most evenings at the kitchen table while Elias sat nearby and read or worked or sometimes just sat, and she would occasionally say, "How did you phrase the thing about the wheat, the line you used when you were explaining it to Thomas?" Or, "What was the name of the justice who married us?" And he'd answer, and it would go into the writing, and in this way the story of what they'd built was made from both of them, the way everything they'd built had been made from both of them. She was still writing it, or something continuous with it, when Elias died. It was January of 1911, and it was not dramatic. He'd been slowing for 2 years, the knee and then the breathing and then the particular dimming that came before the end, that both of them knew what it was, and neither of them called by its name until they had to. He died in the bed in the house he'd built the porch before building on a Thursday morning with the light coming in the east window and Margaret sitting beside him, and Thomas and Clara in the doorway, and it was quiet, and it was not easy, and calling it peaceful would only be true in the technical sense that there was no noise. She sat with him for an hour after. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee the way she did every morning of her life, and she drank it at the table. And the house was different and also the same, and she was 64 years old and alone in a way she had not been in 25 years. Thomas came in and put his hand on her shoulder and didn't say anything, which was the right thing, which he'd learned from his father. Claire sat beside her and held her hand and didn't say anything either, which she'd learned from her mother. The three of them sat in the kitchen in the morning light, and the coffee went cold and none of them moved for a long time. And that was all right, because some mornings require stillness before they require anything else. The papers were what you'd expect. The ranch in Thomas's name, the library in Clara's, the house itself left jointly, various small things left to various neighbors with the quiet precision of a man who'd been thinking about it for longer than he'd said. Margaret went through them the week after, at the kitchen table, with the same systematic attention she'd given everything for 25 years, and she was near the bottom of the stack when she found the folder. It was a plain brown folder, the kind she used for correspondence, tied with a piece of string, and on the front in Elias's cramped handwriting, it said, M. She untied it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, that she recognized before she'd fully unfolded it. She'd seen it only once before. Paul had shown her, years after the wedding, when he was writing a short piece about the early settlement years for the Beacon's anniversary issue. It was the original draft of the newspaper advertisement. Elias's handwriting, the bad spelling, the words crossed out and recrossed, the whole ungainly effort of a man putting something true onto paper without the tools for it. She'd known he had it somewhere, but she'd never asked to see it, because it felt like something that belonged to before her, to the version of him that had been alone with the empty chair and the impossible bet, and she'd respected that the way she'd always respected the parts of him that were his own. She looked at the draft, the familiar 4 sentences, the crossed-out words, the spelling that Paul had fixed before it ran. And then below the last sentence, in the same cramped hand, a line she had never seen before, shorter than the rest, added at a different time by the ink color. Maybe years after, maybe recently, she couldn't say. She read it twice. The kitchen was very quiet. The winter light came through the south window the way it always had, the way it would keep doing long after all of them were gone. The line said, "She came. She chose the chair. I was right to build it first." Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the paper in her hands for a long time. She thought about a man she'd never met putting up a porch before he had walls, building 2 chairs before he had a reason, dropping 4 badly spelled sentences into a newspaper and trusting that honesty was specific enough to find its target across 300 miles of distance. She thought about herself at 28, cutting a newspaper clipping in secret, writing and rewriting and writing again, walking to the post office with her heart doing things she resented. She thought about every letter they'd sent across the cold months, every truth said into the dark before either of them knew if the other one would hold it right. She thought about stepping off a train into a flat, bright world she'd never seen, and a man standing on a platform holding his hat, and the first thing he'd said was, "Your train was late." Not a greeting, just a fact. Just her already inside the tense of his sentence like she'd been expected. She thought about the chair. She got her coat and went out to the porch. The chairs were there, as they'd always been, both of them worn to silver now, the bur oak gone pale and smooth with 30 years of weather and use. Her chair sat where it had always sat, on the left, the one he'd kept empty through a whole Nebraska winter, and then another, the one she'd walked up the steps and sat down in without being asked, like she'd already made the decision before she'd admitted to making it. She sat in it now. She rocked once, the runners moving easy on the boards the way they always had, and she looked out at the land that was hers and her children's, and the winter fields her son would work in the spring with the same stubborn wheat his father had staked everything on and that had held. The prairie was as always, immense and indifferent and quietly magnificent in the way of things that exist on a scale that doesn't require your approval. The wind came down off the flat land and moved through the dead grass the color of old gold, and the second chair beside her rocked in the wind, slightly, on its own. She sat there a long time. What she understood, sitting in the cold with the paper in her coat pocket, was something she'd known in pieces for 25 years, but was only now seeing whole, that Elias Rowan had not been waiting for a woman. He'd been building an argument. The argument was that the future was worth making room for before you could prove it was coming, that you could say yes to a thing before the thing existed, that hope was not a feeling but a structure you put up with your own hands and trusted to hold. Most people waited until they had proof. They waited until the harvest was in before they believed in the seed. They waited until someone loved them before they made space for the love. They waited until the silence broke before they built against it. Elias had built first. That was the whole of it. That was everything. And the thing that had broken Margaret Hale out of her careful, defended, declining life. The thing that had gotten her to the post office, then to the train station, then across 300 miles of unfamiliar country to a stranger's porch, was not romance. It was not the poetry of the empty chair, though there was poetry in it. It was the nerve of the act, the sheer refusing to wait of it, because she'd been waiting her whole life, waiting for permission or proof, or the right man or the right moment, And here was someone who hadn't waited, who'd built the chair before he could justify building it. And she'd understood somewhere past logic that that was the only invitation worth answering. She had been waiting for a question that didn't already know what it wanted from her. She'd written that to him in her first letter, the one she'd nearly burned. And it had been true then, and it was true now. Clara came to the door. She stood there a moment, looking at her mother in the chair, the empty chair beside her rocking in the wind. "Mom," she said gently. "I'm all right," Margaret said. "You've been out here an hour." "I know." She didn't move. "Come sit with me." Clara came out and sat in the other chair, Elias's chair, the right-hand one, the worn one, and they sat together in the cold, mother and daughter, rocking slightly in the wind off the prairie. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked after a while. Margaret looked at the land. 25 years of it. The library building Thomas had helped Elias put up, visible from the porch at an angle. The field where the first wheat had gone in and come up against the odds. The road where she'd driven in on a wagon 30 years ago, looking at all of it for the first time, trying not to show how frightened she was. "I'm thinking about the chairs," she said. Clara looked at them. Both chairs, the two of them, her mother's and the one that was empty now for the first time in decades. "He built them before anything else," Clara said. It wasn't a question. She knew the story. The whole county knew the story, though it had grown and changed in the telling the way stories do. Accumulated detail and legend around the core of it, the way prairie grass grew around a fence post. "He built them before he had walls," Margaret said, "before he had a roof, before there was anyone to sit in the second one." "Why?" Margaret thought about it. Not the simple version, the version she'd tell a stranger or write in a history, but the true version, the one she'd been sitting with for an hour in the cold. "Because some people wait until everything's ready," she said, "and some people build the chair first and trust that the rest will come." She paused. "Your father didn't know the rest was going to come. He just decided it was worth building for anyway, that it was worth saying yes to a future he couldn't prove yet." She looked at the empty chair beside her. "That's not optimism. Optimism is just hoping things turn out. What your father did was harder than that. He built something. He made a shape for the future to fill, and then he kept it empty until the right thing came to fill it. And he didn't let anyone tell him it was foolish, even when he was afraid it might be." Clara was quiet. The wind moved the grass and the chairs rocked, and the winter light was going the way it went in January, fast and without apology. "The letters," Clara said. "You still have them?" "Every one." "All of his?" "All of his and all of mine. He sent mine back to me. Did you know that? Years ago, he'd kept every letter I wrote him, and he tied them up and gave them back to me on our 10th anniversary and said they were mine, and he thought I should have them." She touched the pocket where the draft was folded. "He kept the ad. He had it in his papers." "What did it say?" "The original." Margaret told her. The 4 sentences, the bad spelling, the line below that she'd never seen before. Clara sat with it. She was 30 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's hands, and she had grown up in the library and in the fields and in the particular atmosphere of a household where 2 people had built something on purpose and meant it. And she understood things about what that took that she couldn't have articulated yet and would spend the rest of her life figuring out how to say. "He was right," Clara said finally. "Simple. No decoration." "He was right," Margaret said. They sat until the light was gone, the 2 of them in the 2 chairs, and then they went inside where it was warm, and Thomas had made something on the stove, and the house smelled like the house had always smelled, and the chairs stayed on the porch in the dark, rocking slightly in the wind, both of them worn to the same silver, both of them holding the shape of the people who'd sat in them for a quarter century. The one on the left would not stay empty. That was the thing about a chair built right. It holds. Someone always comes. And the someone who came to this one had chosen it, had gotten on a train and crossed 300 miles and walked up the porch steps and sat down without being asked, because a man she'd never met had built it first and trusted she was worth building for, and she had trusted the same thing about him, and they had both been right, which was not guaranteed and had not been easy and had been, in the fullest sense of a word that gets used too cheaply, enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that lasts.